This is a story about connections between conservation and economic development, between a community's appearance and its quality of life, between the man-made environment and the natural environment, and perhaps most important of all, between people and the places they live. 30 years ago, the former Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall wrote something that is sadly more true today than ever. America today stands on a pinnacle of wealth and power, and yet we live in a land of vanishing beauty, of increasing ugliness, of shrinking open space, of an overall environment diminished daily by noise, pollution, and blight. Please don't misunderstand. America is the world's leader in environmental protection. Over the last 30 years, we've passed many laws to reduce air and water pollution, clean up toxic waste, protect our sand dunes and wetlands. We've encouraged energy conservation and recycling, added thousands of buildings and monuments to the National Register of Historic Places, and millions of acres to our state and national parks. But despite these successes, the special character of America's small towns and our countryside has been disappearing faster than ever. At the same time we've been saving some landmarks, we've been losing the landscape that gives these landmarks their larger sense of meaning. And while we've been cleaning up air and water pollution, we've been losing our sense of place. I mean, if you were suddenly dropped along a road outside of almost any American city, you wouldn't have the slightest idea where you were, because it all looks exactly the same. You wouldn't know if you were in Albany or Allentown, Providence or Pittsburgh, Charlotte or Cincinnati. As the famous Western author Wallace Stegner once wrote, "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." All of us have a fundamental need for a sense of orientation, a sense of roots, a sense of place. What is sense of place? First, it's what makes your hometown different from my hometown. Second, and perhaps more important, it's what makes our physical surroundings worth caring about. In many parts of America, we are suffering the social consequences of living in places that simply aren't worth caring about. For all the improvements we've made in cleaning the air and water, building roads and schools, faster computers, many people still ask, is this all there is? Can't our communities be more distinctive, more livable, more beautiful? A few years ago, Victoria Tashinkle, the former Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of Florida, said, "I think we can probably take care of pollution-related problems in Florida, but even if we do, I'm not sure this is going to be a very nice place to live because of the density of population and the lack of sense of community. Florida could end up as just one convenience store after another." Her words are true for cities and towns all over America. Growth is both certain and desirable, but the destruction of community character and natural resources that too often accompanies growth is not inevitable. Progress does not demand degraded surroundings. Communities can grow without destroying the things that people love. The real questions are not whether your town will grow, because it will, or whether it will change, because it will. The real questions are how. How will it change and how will it grow? As our communities expand, we need to plan for growth by carefully planning and managing the patterns of development. To accomplish this, communities must consider three things. Where do you put development? How do you arrange it? And what does it look like? Here are some examples of what is meant by patterns of development. This is the cornfield at Antietam, Maryland, the site of the bloodiest day in the history of the United States. During the Civil War, 23,000 Americans fell here on a September afternoon in 1862. If you visit this place, you can almost visualize the waves of infantry moving across the field, sense the urgency and how history was changed there that day. Yet the National Trust for Historic Preservation once listed this site as one of the nation's 10 most endangered historic places. It's off the list today, thanks to the hard work of many people. But what was it in danger of? If you travel 100 miles south to Spotsylvania County, Virginia, you'll find the site of the South's greatest victory in the Civil War, the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is the Salem Church that was a key feature during the fighting, a makeshift Confederate fortress. After the battle, it served as a hospital for the wounded of both sides. Lovingly restored, the church is not only a national historic landmark, but a classic example of saving a structure and losing a place. This is why the battlefield at Antietam was in danger. So what's wrong with this picture? There are better places in America to put a shopping center than in the middle of our historic and hallowed grounds. The point is, some places are better for development than others. The first principle of better development is planning where you should and should not develop. Every community needs a blueprint for how it wants to grow. Two tools used for this are a conservation plan and an economic development plan. These allow us to have both conservation and development, and to help communities preserve their identities. But part of the problem is how we think about conservation and development. This is a view of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and this, a town just outside the park. Sometimes we think there are only two choices: either preserve the land or develop all of it. Either create a park with nobody living in it, or allow ugly, environmentally insensitive development right next door, even though the landscape there may be just as outstanding. But these aren't the only choices we have. We have a third choice. We can have growth and development that respects and enhances the character of our communities, and that complements the quality of our landscape. This concept has different names: sustainable development, smart growth, but it's really about development that's good for the environment, good for business, and good for the community. Let's consider a few examples, starting with something very simple: residential street design. If you're a developer, the most expensive part of the development process is building the streets. So let's look at this subdivision in Wisconsin, where the street is 24 feet across from curb to curb. In this Virginia subdivision, on the other hand, the street is 40 feet across. On which street would you rather live? On which street do you think the houses are more affordable? Which street is better for the environment? And which street is safer for children? First, compare the cost of the houses. If you add 16 feet of pavement to the width of the street, you increase the cost of the houses along that street by thousands of dollars. So more pavement means less affordable housing. More pavement also means more soil erosion, more sedimentation, and more water pollution going into our rivers and streams. And as far as safety is concerned, the 24-foot wide street is 4 times safer than the 40-foot wide street. Why? Because the wider the streets are, the faster the cars go. So being more flexible on residential street standards is good for business, good for the environment, and good for the community. Now think about trees. Here are 2 streets with identical houses on each. Which street do you think has higher property values? Which street has lower utility bills? And on which street would you rather live? Studies show that developed lots with trees sell for an average of 20 to 25% more than similar-sized lots without trees. The temperature here on a hot summer day can be 6 degrees higher than the temperature here on that same day. As it turns out, dollars do grow on trees. In short, trees are good for business, good for the environment, and good for the community. What about shopping centers? Would you prefer to shop in a center heavily landscaped with trees and bushes, or would you prefer to shop here? Well, look at what happened in Baldwin County, the southernmost county in Alabama on the shore of the Mobile Bay. Baldwin County was once a very hard place to get to until Interstate 10 was built. In a short time, investors started buying up land along other highways, cutting down the live oak trees and replacing them with strip malls. But many of the residents didn't like what was happening to their trees, so they proposed the first law in the state to preserve large trees, specifically in the parking lots of commercial buildings. Those who objected to this regulation said things like, "Nobody will go to the grocery store if there's a tree in front of it." So the county conducted a public opinion poll and asked their citizens if they would prefer to shop at a center heavily landscaped with trees and bushes, or one without such landscaping. What happened? By a wide margin, people said they preferred trees to asphalt, and they passed that regulation, the first one in Alabama's history. This was the beginning of Baldwin County thinking about the relationship between community character and economic development. Now let's consider the gateway to a community, its front door. Just like with meeting a person, a good first impression is important, a bad one hard to change. So would you rather visit Franklin, Tennessee, or Midfield, Alabama? Which one looks like a community with a sense of pride and a sense of place? Which one looks like a place you would rather spend time and money in? Every day, people make decisions about where to live, where to invest, where to vacation, and where to retire based on what our communities look like. The image of your community is fundamentally important to its economic well-being. Think about visiting a new town or city, for instance. The more one community looks like every place else in America, the less reason there is to visit. On the other hand, the more a community does to enhance and preserve what makes it unique, the more reason there is to go there. That's because tourism is about seeking out those places in the world that are different, unusual, and unique. If every place was just like every place else, there'd be no reason to go anyplace. That's why the image of a community is fundamentally important to its economic well-being. Do you think tourists would rather see scenic views that look like this, or scenic views that look like this? As the Urban Land Institute once noted, housing, hotels, and offices with scenic views always command premium prices. The better the view, the higher the price. Now think about where you live. Before World War II, America had a model for development that worked for over 300 years. We called it a town. But after World War II, people decided to rearrange things. While we still have buildings, we now throw shopping centers over here and we put schools over there and put our houses over here. The result, we have to drive everywhere for everything. Recently, though, a national survey showed most people would prefer to shop in a town center if they had a choice. As a result, we're actually building town centers again for the first time in 50 years. An example is Cascade Village in Loudoun County, Virginia. This would have been a strip shopping center just 5 or 6 years ago. As another example, this is Barnes & Noble Super Bookstore, located on a busy highway just outside of Washington, D.C. Notice the big parking lot in front. It's similar to what you'd see in strip shopping centers all over America. On the other hand, this is Barnes & Noble's store located in downtown Bethesda, Maryland. It's built right on the sidewalk. And while there's parking in the neighborhood, there's no parking lot directly in front of the building. So which one do you think makes more money? The one with the big parking lot in front, or this one? Surprising to many, the downtown store makes 15% more per square foot than the one on the strip. And the reasons? Well, think about how you get to these two stores. The only way to get to the one on the strip is to drive. But there are more ways to get to the other store. You can walk because it's located in a neighborhood, or you could ride your bike, or take the subway, or you could drive. And when you do get here, you'll find yourself in a real neighborhood where people hang out, walk around, and window shop. How many people do you know who go to strip shopping centers to hang out? In short, merchants in town centers are more successful because people spend more time on Main Street. In fact, the idea of a Main Street is the single hottest retailing concept in America today, a vision we abandoned 50 years ago. People are still drawn to these main streets because they're natural gathering places where you can enjoy a cup of coffee, read a magazine, meet your friends, or window shop. In addition, many communities are realizing why it's important to identify and preserve their historic buildings, neighborhoods, and landscapes, because they physically link us to our past, tell us who we are and where we came from. Preserving historic buildings is good for the heart and soul of a community, but it's also good for the pocketbook of a community. Let's look at a small example. This used to be the fire station in a small Midwestern town. When it became obsolete as a fire station, it was turned into a pizza parlor, but sales were low, so the owner of the restaurant restored the appearance of the building, physically linking his customers to the roots in the past. What else happened? Within the first year, pizza sales went up by 75%, showing how preservation can be enormously good for the bottom line. Or consider some larger examples, such as the Riverwalk in San Antonio, Texas. This is one of the nation's leading tourist attractions and the basis of the city's billion-dollar tourism industry. What most visitors don't know, however, is that at one point the cities thought so little of this small river, they tried to put it underground, into a culvert. In Seattle, Pike Place Market is the epitome of the city's working waterfront. Today, it is the single leading destination in Washington, visited by 11 million people a year. Yet less than 30 years ago, the city seriously suggested demolishing the Pike Place Market to create a parking lot in its place. You can have all the parking in the world, But if you have nothing to do, then why would you want to go there? And in Florida, you'll find the Art Deco Historic District in South Miami Beach. It's the largest collection of Art Deco buildings in the United States. Once again, all were scheduled for demolition. Yet today, people come from all over the world to visit this place. While most people are in favor of preserving the best of their past, they also need to think about what's being built today that will be worth preserving tomorrow. In other words, what buildings will you and your children fight to save 50 years from now? This is an important question because 80% of everything ever built in America has been constructed since the end of World War II. And as Winston Churchill once said, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. Meaning the physical character of our communities affects our sense of community. But it's hard to have a sense of community in a parking lot. So how can we get new buildings to enhance the character of our communities? Does every franchise and chain store in America have to look exactly alike? Of course not. New buildings can be designed to fit in with the character of a community and can complement the quality of the surrounding landscape. Yes, that's a new McDonald's. It's in a house that was built in 1873 in the small town of New Hyde Park, New York. Prospective brides even come here to pose for their bridal photographs. Or consider this McDonald's in Stowe, Vermont. Why does it look like a typical New England-style building? Well, because it's in New England. We live in a nation of highly varied history, climate, culture, and terrain. So why shouldn't the buildings in one part of America look different from buildings in another part? Shouldn't buildings in New England look different from buildings in the Southwest? The Southwest different from the Southeast? The Southeast different from the Midwest? Shouldn't buildings in a small town like Lake Forest, Illinois, be different from buildings in a big city like St. Louis, Missouri? Yes, that's also McDonald's, at the foot of the famous Gateway Arch. It was built by a smart developer who realized that when fast food was no longer the novelty, design could be. He realized that our image of St. Louis is painted by its past. Images of the Mississippi River, Mark Twain, and riverboats, thus a McDonald's on a riverboat. The point is, if communities accept off-the-shelf corporate cookie-cutter architecture, they'll get it 100% of the time. On the other hand, if they insist on something better, something that fits with their community, they'll get that 100% of the time. Do national franchises and chain stores like to do this? No, not particularly, but they'll do whatever they have to do to be in an economically profitable location. For instance, this is the McDonald's in Freeport, Maine. The company bought this house in the 1970s with the intention of tearing it down and putting up a typical suburban-style McDonald's. But the town said, no, we want you to restore that house. McDonald's sued the town and lost. Now the company promotes this restaurant as an example of their good community stewardship. But they'll only do this when cities and towns are wise enough to say, first, we want a building that looks like it belongs in our community, and not just any place USA. Of course, the idea of community pride in place can apply to more than just buildings. Let's think about tourism again, with this ad out of an airline magazine. It says a chain of hotels should reflect the city they are located in and not each other. Here's a chain motel in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, home to the country's largest Amish population. When visitors arrive, they find busy commercial strips with look-alike motels instead of what they imagine the countryside would be. Rolling green hills, white farmhouses with red barns, small old-fashioned town centers. Elkhart County, Indiana, on the other hand, is also home to a large Amish population. A few years ago, they sent a delegation to Lancaster for ideas on how to attract tourists. They came back with two big ideas. First, establish a land trust to preserve open land. Second, develop design guidelines for new tourism support facilities, giving developers a strong suggestion of what ought to be done. The result? This is one of Elkhart's new chain motels. As you can see, they learned from Lancaster's mistakes. Here's an off-the-shelf 7-Eleven. Compare it to this new 7-Eleven. Or consider gas stations. The canopy of this one looks like a spacecraft. True, canopies prevent rain from reaching the customer, but they come in all shapes and styles. Here's one in Asheville, North Carolina that fits right in with the character of the community. Or how about this one? This new gas station is located in Waitsfield, a small town in Vermont. Notice how it looks like a country store. That's because it's in the country. How about chain drugstores like Rite Aid, CVS, Eckert's, Brooks? Here's a typical off-the-shelf Rite Aid. But this new one, located in Camden, Maine, was designed to look like a typical New England store because, once again, it's in New England. Notice how this Rite Aid in Washington, D.C. blends in with its neighbors. Or this one in Lake Placid, New York, with stone on the bottom, articulated roofline, and wood siding. Such designs are common in the Adirondacks. And what about the big box retailers like a Kmart or Walmart? Here's a typical Kmart. This on one hand is the Kmart in Jackson, Wyoming. This is a community trying to preserve its Western heritage. So this Kmart with clock towers on each end, articulated roof lines, and a wooden front looks like it belongs. Sometimes people say it's too late for our community. We already have too much clutter. Actually, it's never too late. Community character deteriorates slowly over time, but it can get better in small steps. For instance, this used to be a McDonald's in Asheville, North Carolina. Now there's a new McDonald's built on the site of the old one. This is a city that's decided that community character is important, so they're improving it one building at a time. Your community can get better too, one street, one building, and one development at a time. The famous oceanographer Jacques Cousteau used to say, "People will save what they love." But how can we create the sense of love and caring for our communities? One way is through education and interpretation. Every community has a story to describe these traditions through historic markers, interpretive displays, and public art. For example, this is the Chisholm Trail mural in Fort Worth, Texas, which tells the story of how cattle drives were so important to the founding of Fort Worth. And this is the family album of Tacoma Park, Maryland. Every one of these pictures is important to that town's history. Once, Spokane, Washington once manufactured the famous radio flyer wagons. What do they have there now? This piece of playground equipment, a piece of public art that physically connects people to their city's past. Or how about Clanton, Alabama, the state's peach capital, where they use their water tower to create a sense of place and tell a story about their town. Signs tell us much about the character of a community too. Outdoor signs are important because they give us direction and needed information. A business sign can be colorful, decorative, even distinguished. All too often, however, signs are oversized, poorly planned, and badly located. They're also too numerous. So what's wrong with this picture? 3 things. It's ugly, it's expensive, and it doesn't work. Signs project the image of a community faster than almost anything else. These are before and after pictures of the same place. Think about the images the signs project. Do you want the image of your community to be classy or trashy, tacky or plain, special or ordinary, ugly or beautiful? When you look at this shopping center in Highlands, North Carolina, does it make you want to live there? When you see the sign in this other town, do you feel like you'd like to vacation here? Image is fundamentally important to the economic well-being of our communities. This is obviously a community that didn't pay attention to its image. On the other hand, communities that get more investment, more business, and more visitors pay attention to their appearance. Another aspect of signs is effectiveness. Imagine one store owner getting a big sign, then a competitor getting a bigger sign, then a third person getting an even bigger sign. Before you know it, you'd be advertising to airplanes instead of people. A cluttered commercial strip with huge signs, flags, and banners like this is ineffective because they prevent you from finding what you're looking for. It's almost impossible to absorb the overload of information on a cluttered commercial strip like this. But when you turn down the volume, every voice becomes distinct. In short, businesses do a better job of selling because people can see what they're looking for. But what exactly makes one community successful and another unsuccessful? Successful communities are good places to live, work, and invest because they do a few simple things. They make an inventory of their assets and create a vision for the future. They build all their plans, whether it's a tourism plan, an economic development plan, or a land use plan, around their assets. They use education, incentives, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulations. They pick and choose among developments, realizing not all development is created equal. They cooperate with resource managers for mutual benefit. They consider what a community looks like. They have a quality of life lobby. Let's look at these ideas in more detail. Successful communities look at what they have to offer and build their plans around their assets. Sometimes assets are obvious, such as those found in Boulder, Colorado, or Annapolis, Maryland, which has an obvious architectural legacy in a beautiful harbor. But sometimes these assets are not so obvious. Lowell, Massachusetts is an example. It was an industrial town of worn-out and abandoned mill buildings that used its architectural heritage to its advantage, creatively reusing the mill buildings for commercial space, museums, and housing. Successful communities use education, incentives, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. The town of Pella, Iowa, for instance, gives new developers a handbook about why the architectural character of that town is important. They do this because they want new franchises, chain stores, and big box retailers to fit in. Successful communities also consider what they look like. The cover of the Vermont State Tourist Brochure boasts that there are no billboards in the state. Why? Vermont is one of the 5 heavily tourism-dependent states that have removed all their billboards because they found that it is one of the most important things they can do to strengthen the tourism industry. Petersburg, Virginia, on the other hand, could have been the Williamsburg of the Civil War, but it's not, because they didn't pay any attention to what they look like. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is another community that thinks aesthetics is important. Since there were no utility wires running through the battlefield in 1863, the community worked to bury 5 miles of utility wires through that battlefield, restoring its sense of place. So what do you want your community to look like in 20 years? If you don't ask that question, it'll end up looking like any place USA. You see, there are really only 2 kinds of change in America: unplanned change or planned change. Failing to plan simply means planning to fail. Finally, let's think about the social and psychological value of the ideas presented today. Why is it that people feel a sense of loss, like losing a loved one or a friend when a grove of trees is cut down, an historic building demolished, or a scenic view obliterated? It's not because we can't plant new trees or build new buildings. It's because our sense of identity is tied in a very profound way to special buildings, places, and views. Each has a rich symbolic importance, which contributes to our sense of identity and well-being. In fact, long ago, an ancient Roman statesman said, cities should preserve the visible symbols of their identity to give their citizens a sense of security in a changing world. 2,000 years later, anthropologist Margaret Mead said almost exactly the same thing. The destruction of things that are familiar and important causes great anxiety in people. Economic development and environmental quality aside, what we're often trying to preserve is memory, an attempt to keep a mental image of familiar and accustomed places that make us feel comfortable and secure. The justification for preserving the special places of any community have as much to do with our need for psychological stability and cultural continuity as they have to do with beauty, ecology, or economics. Our communities can grow without destroying the things that people love. The landscapes of our states and regions, the countryside, the cities and the small towns are worth preserving not just because they're fragile and beautiful and rich in cultural and natural resources, but because they help us define who we are as a nation.